Finally, we'll walk through the actual mobile experience of collecting. We'll upload lab results, and then we've actually have a zone creation prescription writing tool that's in beta currently. And so we'll showcase what that's looking like, along with the ability to then just view those results within our analytics tools as well. So that's the overview, but we're going to jump right in and spend most of our time actually looking at the product and the functionality. So with that, housekeeping things, if you do have questions, post it in the chat, and I'm going to take some time at the end to address any questions that come up. What you're looking at now, this is controller. So this is our web view, and I'm going to do a few account setup type things from this view before we jump over to the mobile application. So as I talked about, we're going to hopefully hit all the three types of sample collection. So if you're watching this, one of these three scenarios hopefully kind of hits home with how you collect. So I'm going to start out by talking about zone sampling and how you can upload existing pins. So to do this within FarmQA, we use our map layer functionality. So the first thing you can do, and as you go back and watch this video, you can pause and make sure you're doing step by step. But the first thing we do when it comes to zone sampling is allow you to upload your existing zone maps. So this would be something where you've defined, perhaps I'm going to use a GK ADMS example of bringing in an existing zone map into FarmQA, and then using that on the mobile app to sample on top of that zone map itself. So what I'll walk through first is within FarmQA, we have a map layer feature. And what I'm doing in this screen is I'm essentially setting up a folder to house these zone maps that I will upload in the next step. So I actually have a zone map created as a folder, but in this process, you'd click the blue button on the bottom left, create a name called zone maps. And a key thing here is the layer type. So when it comes to this folder, typically we think of zone maps as being a growing season layer, meaning that it will only show up in the season that you upload it to. So at this point, we can save that layer, and on the top right, save button, that folder is now created. The next step is actually uploading your zone map. And so in this screen, what I'll do is I'll click on the particular field that I have for my example. Once I do that, the left-hand pane is going to allow me to upload that layer. So in the layer section, we have the add layer button, at which point we can choose our folders for housing that spatial data or the zone maps. So I'll click on the zone map, and now we can upload that layer. So we can click on this button, which opens up the ability to search your computer, or you can drag and drop. So in my case, I've got a zone file from ADMS. As I drop that in there, it will respect the color schemes that were defined. And then at this point, I can customize this a little bit as far as labels and colors go. So what I'll do is I'll just turn on those labels with the zone IDs. I want those to display. You could adjust your color schemes, but again, that is respected from the file that we uploaded. So once you save that, you now have your zone map in FarmQA. I'm going to show you shortly how you can see this on the mobile app to actually collect. But one additional step I want to take before we do that when it comes to zone sampling is if you have zone maps, but also existing pins, you can upload those as well. So let's say you're coming to FarmQA, you're coming off an existing software solution, and you have a set of GPS pins of where you sampled over previous years. We can bulk upload that if it's a .csv file, if it's a shape file, KML, KMZ. So that's what I'll walk through next is in the left-hand pane, you see the map details. And our soil sampling pin layer is a layer that you can turn on and off within this view. But you'll notice you also have a pin icon. And if you click on that, this gives you a drop zone. And this is the particular location where you can upload your existing pins. So if I go back to my folder structure or my computer, I've got a zone sample pin or points example. And if I drop this in, I now get the option to choose the attribute I want to use as a label. And after I upload this, this now brings in those existing pins. So now collectively, what I've done throughout this process is now I have a zone map along with predefined pins of where I want to sample within those zones or where I've done that in previous years. So that's kind of an example here of uploading zones, defining points ahead of time. Now, although I uploaded those points for the zone scenario, you could do the same thing for composites, the same thing for grids if you have existing points. The next flow I'll talk through is if you want to define those points within FarmQA. And so I'll do that by talking through the grid example. And so I'll jump over to some of my grid fields that I have set up. So I have two scenarios here. One, if you look at the grid sample north, is I've done that same thing I just did for the zone map where I've uploaded existing grids. The south field, I don't have any existing pins. I'm planning to create those within FarmQA from scratch. So what I'll walk through next as part of this flow is I'll actually introduce the task function, as that then relates to how we create those grids and assign who should be collecting it. So keep this visual in mind. North has pins, south does not. If I click into my fields tab, I'm going to create task for this. I'll search down so you can simplify it a little bit. My grid sample north field and my grid sample south field. So I'll select those and I will schedule a task. So in the top right, if I click on that, I now get a drop down for you can customize your task options in here. A little teaser here, I will be talking more in depth about the task types beyond soil sampling in our next webinar. But for now, we'll just hit on the soil sampling task type. So I've done that, and it gives me a list view of all the fields I have selected. And where you see this check mark or the slash through it, it means currently those fields do not have pins associated within the task. So when I come into the grid sampling north, again, I've got a little background noise there, and wouldn't mind muting their microphones on your side. So anyway, when we come into the north field where I mentioned already having predefined points, this is where we have an action pane in the top left. And so in this example, we have this little pin icon itself. What that allows me to do is it displays those existing pins. So this would have been a scenario where I uploaded from a CSV file from a previous system or previous season. And then within this particular task, I can choose which of these points I want to sample this season. So for example, if this field was split, maybe you select half of them. If you're doing the whole field, you can select all those grid points and say, for 2022, fall 2022, we're going to sample all these points. In addition to that, you can define or kind of ad hoc drop new points. So you can say, well, we didn't quite kind of sample in the nose here, so we can drop a pin there as well. And then I can save that off. So those are the points where we're saying in the north field, we need to sample. In the south field, remember that was an example where I did not have existing pins. Therefore, I do not have that pin icon where I can pull up existing points. So instead, I'm going to create those in real time. That's what this little grid icon represents. If I click on that, it displays a series of grid sample points. On the top right is where I can define my density. So let's say I do 2.5 acre grids. You can see how that now spreads out those points to that corresponding density. And then I can rotate this to whatever kind of a density pattern or alignment works best with this field shape. So in this particular example, I might want to play with the boundaries. And if I click on this middle circle, this allows me to shift that whole grid. So again, if I grab, you can see my little hand icon, and I pull this left and right or clockwise, counterclockwise, I rotate, but the center circle allows me to pivot. So once I get an alignment that I'm happy with as far as these grids, let's say I'm going to go right there, you can now click this check mark, and it more or less clips those points within that boundary. So now we've got defined points, but as you can see here, we still have some that fall right on the boundary. So we allow you to more or less clean these up. So if I click on this point, I can click the delete on my laptop or use this eraser icon, and I can delete points that aren't relevant. And just like before, I can add new pins where you might want to catch a few spots. And so this is the opportunity to create that grid and then edit or move. So we could also adjust these, moving them laterally as well if we wanted to grab pins and place those or move them slightly. This might be a good example where it's close to a power line, so we're going to move that one north. So at this point, we can save that out. So both of these are now associated to what I would call soil sampling tasks, and they have the associated pins of where someone should collect within those fields. The next screen is going to show you what details you can associate to those tasks. So for example, if I say, of these samples, we need to collect topsoil and subsoil samples or just topsoil. Then you can select a date. So let's say we need to get this done by the end of the month. This is, we'll call it medium priority. And then this is your user list. So again, when I talk about task, this is really kind of targeted at if you're managing a team of collectors, you can define who should collect it. And we'll say, put a note in there, collect and send to AgVice, for example. We can now save that out, and that is now associated to those users, and they can pull it up on the app and actually collect. So those are some of the main things that I would talk through as far as kind of setting up ahead of time. The next thing we'll talk through is how you can now define points more in real time and actually collect on the mobile application. The one last thing I will point out before I move on is on the left-hand side, you see the work tab. That's a new tab within FarmQA. So if you click on that, you now see a list of all those tasks or outstanding tasks. And you can do things like group by who they're assigned to or priority level. So you kind of get a breakdown of what's outstanding, how many samples need to be collected on what fields. And so it's allowing you to manage the collection and the process of what's been done, what hasn't. Now let's jump over to the mobile application and start to show you some information on the collection side of things. So if I minimize here, I'm going to jump over. Here we go. Should still be showing my iPad. So now this is an iPad that I'm running here next to my computer. And those who are familiar with the mobile application, the kind of the big difference here being that your GPS is displayed. Let's see here. Just went to sleep on me. So your GPS is displayed on the mobile app. That's one key difference between what you're seeing on the web view versus the mobile application. But now what you'll see that's new here as well is that work tab in the bottom right. So what I'll do is I'll actually tap on that. I know it's going to be kind of hard to see where I tap, but if I tap on that work tab, and I'm going to sync in any recent work items that I've created here. Let me double check here that I created those correctly. All right, so we've got a couple work items. Let me backtrack a little bit here for you guys, get that set up. So once again, I'm going to create that grid so I can get that to show up on my mobile application for you. So we'll say that's the grid, 2.5 acres. Here we go. Associate to the end of the month and save that out. Okay, now I should be able to jump back to the mobile application and see those work items here. Okay, so we'll jump over to the mobile application now, and this is where you can see one particular field. But if I jump into that work tab, this is where I should be able to see either all the items or the items that are assigned to me specifically. And what I'll need to do here is jump up to the top. So apologize for that delay, but this is where I was getting to is on the work tab. This is where you can actually see all those outstanding tasks. And what I've done here is, if you recall that soil sampling north fields, I'll search grid sampling north. You can see that's actually a task for somebody to do. And if I tap on that from the mobile side, we now see the details displayed of all the information I filled out. So this is a soil sampling task. It's designed for, created by me for Brady, finished by a certain date. And now if I click this blue arrow, it's going to jump me into that field with those points defined. And so this is where I've got the grid points. And from this view, I can zoom in. Again, your GPS would be displayed. So you'd have a green GPS circle. And as you drove throughout the field, you could drive in, tap on a point. If I was actually on my phone or my iPad, I could scan a barcode. So that would automatically enter in, let's say, an AgVice barcode number and associate it to that point. Now you can see that previously had an asterisk, now it clears out, meaning that it's collected and you can move on. So with this too, you can rotate the map. So north isn't always north, and you can keep your alignment straight with where you want to go next. And so you can continue to enter in barcodes and collect in this manner, again, with your physical GPS shown relative to these points. And we also support alphanumeric with those barcode scans. And so that would be associating to these points. And then as you continued, you could sample each one of these locations. Once you're done, you can use this check mark to submit and complete that task. So doing that allows me to save. I can add a note. So let's say I wanted to add a note for maybe a supervisor or a colleague to say, didn't sample east side, too wet. And now that's going to be associated with that work item and that task. So that's the flow on those grids where we've previously defined it. You come into the mobile application, you see those grids, and you go point by point, scan a barcode, it closes out that point. Talking through, so kind of rewinding back to the zone scenario, because we uploaded that zone map, we can now click on this field. We can see if we slide up from the bottom, we get the opportunity to sync layers. And so that's intentional on our side, where as you upload data into the program, this chooses or pick and choose how much data you want to pull down. And so we've got a sync interface where you can say, I want my zone maps for a period of time, let's say 30 days, and then you can sync or hit that sync wheel, and that will actually pull those layers down to your mobile application, iPad, Android, iOS. So once that is synced, you can now slide up from the bottom. We call that a drawer handle, but within the drawer, you can now display or overlay that zone map along with those sample points that I displayed or uploaded. So within this mode, you now have, again, your GPS. You can zoom in and out on these zones. And as you sample or drive throughout, same flow here as far as navigating to a point, scanning a barcode, and associating that to the data. So just want to talk through that additional component of that zone scenario where you've got the layer that you can pull up to direct your efforts along with the points themselves. Now, I mentioned composite at the beginning, and we haven't talked about that yet. And so the reason for that, I want to talk through composite samples as being more so real time as you're out in the field and you want to define where you're collecting, but it's going to be a point that's saved in FarmQA so that it can be accessed in the future. So for example, I'm going to go into composite 1. So if I tap on this field, we get the boundary displayed. And what you can do within FarmQA at any point in time is you can use this blue plus button to drop pins based on your device's GPS. And so if you're in this field and you want to do composite, but you want to track where you collect that composite sample, you can click that blue plus button, and that gives you the menu option at the bottom where you can then collect soil samples. So if I tap on the shovel, I can now I get into more or less sampling mode. See if I get my mobile view to display better here. So now I'm in sampling mode. Let's say it's on an iPhone like you're seeing here. And so your GPS will be displayed, but now the interface is very simplified. You've got this plus button to just start dropping pins. So think of it as kind of a rapid fire mode of dropping pins and scanning barcodes. Again, because I'm on a computer, our barcode scanner doesn't pull up, but if I was on an iPad, it would, or iPhone or Android, and it would start putting in your barcode numbers, associating them to points. And so that's kind of the real-time mode of if you don't want to define things ahead of time, you can simply jump on the mobile application and start dropping points, and then those will be stored and saved and accessible to you, let's say next fall, or even accessible to upload results to if that's something that you'd like to do within FarmQA. So that kind of hopefully covers the 3 scenarios, the zones of pulling up the additional layers, the grids of defining them, or if you've got existing grids uploading. What I'd like to talk about next is actually bringing in lab results, walking through the zone creation, the prescription writer, and then viewing analytics on that. So what I'll do, I'll jump back into the web view. And one thing to note, as you start to close out tickets, this will show you kind of the state will go to in progress versus closed. And then within the soils tab is where we'll spend kind of the rest of the time for reference here. So clicking on the soils tab, we have come up with a new kind of soil sample grid view, so you can start to kind of consume and see these, see the data within here. So what we'll do at this point here, let me jump back to all my fields. So if you recall, when I was in the mobile application, I had pulled up grid sampling north, and I had started clicking through some of my samples. And so you can see the points displayed on the right-hand side, kind of a few basics of what you're looking at here. It's a 3-pane view where the left is allowing me to kind of click between my fields and see those points where I sampled, what the results were. So that's a toggle. In the middle, we actually see the results, and you can kind of group this or pivot the data how you'd like, depending on how you want to consume or see that data. But then what I want to point out is the content in the middle is the collection date. This reference number, for example, is the barcode. So if I would have actually scanned a barcode, that would populate here, and that's going to allow us to upload the lab results back to a GPS point. And so we kind of circumvent the need for putting in GPS points or lat longs when you submit to a lab, because that's tracked in our system. You can also see the work item. So if you want to group, let's say you've been sampling this field for 10 years, and the most recent work item is item 100. You could search or sort and filter by 100 and filter down to just those results. The other thing to note is that these panes are adjustable. So we get the comment of, I want a bigger map. And so we give you that flexibility here. I mean, you can also, zoom in as far as you want. And we also allow you to edit pins in this mode. So kind of going into next season, you can manipulate those pin locations that I scanned. If there's an error, let's say it was a GPS error that needed to be corrected, you can do that here. So this is where the barcodes flow in. So this is kind of a intermediate phase where we have the barcode but no results. So the next step in this process is bringing in the results from the lab. So what we do in that front is, right now we can upload or ingest soil data via CSV or Excel files. What we're actively working on is lab integrations. So this would become more seamless as we go forward and build integrations for labs that are meaningful to you. But I will talk through the CSV process for now. And the way this works is we create, or you can create, an import profile. And what that is, you're more or less mapping out the columns you see in your Excel file with how that's going to map or look in FarmQA. So this is really kind of the meat and potatoes of the import profile, where this left-hand column represents the data from the labs or what you see in your CSV file. And then you start to tell us what soil property is at, the units of measure, what was the sample collection depth, and then a metric is kind of how we map this back into our analytics view. So a lot of this populates once you pick a property, but there is kind of a one-time setup here to create your profile. The nice thing with this is that you can create a profile per lab. So if you work with multiple labs, you can be bringing in data, and then within our tools, the data looks very similar. So we kind of standardize the data once it's in. Same thing goes for if you have different testing packages, you can set up different profiles. With that said, one-time setup, profiles created. Now the step to get the data in is simply a drag and drop of a CSV. So again, I'll go back to my file structure, and actually one step. So the import button is right here on the top left, the little up arrow, or I guess it's a side arrow. But you click on that. If you had multiple profiles, this would be a drop-down list of what lab you're bringing results in from. I'll click on my AgVice full package, and now we get a couple of options where it's going to ask us of the, I guess this is my grower farm field trees, the way you can think about this. Where are you going to be uploading? This happens to be for my prescription fields. What growing season? This is for 22. The marker type, so you can create tissue samples versus soil samples versus sap samples, and you could have those as, again, a drop down, so you're mapping this back correctly in FarmQA. And then an associated collection date. If the collection date is in the CSV file, we will override what you input here. So don't worry about putting in the wrong date with that. So now what I'll do is I'll bring in my CSV file. And before I do that, I'll just give you a glimpse at what this looks like as far as structure goes. We can handle lots of different structures as far as how the data is laid out because of that mapping concept. You tell us what columns we should look for, and then we're going to name match. And so the order is irrelevant in here as long as the content is here, as far as, you know, things like your grower name. In my case, I put prescription field, your field ID, sample ID. Those are the critical pieces. And then the mapping I did points us back to the nutrients and the actual column names to be looking for. So this is an example, but your particular CSV doesn't have to match this identically. So if I close this out, so now that was just to show you what it looks like, but to import, we just have to drag and drop that CSV file into our drop zone. Once I do that, we are actively doing the import process. We get a window that just told us that we imported 48 records. I happen to have 48 sample points with no errors. Once I close that, now you'll notice that this middle pane is going to show us the results, where before it was just placeholders. It's how you can think about it with the points. And so on the right-hand side, you can see the collection points, but now in this grid, we can start to look at our collection date, the reference number, or more or less the point number, and then the content itself. So what are our potassium levels, phosphorus, sulfur, and the data is kind of broken down in grids. Again, we talked about pivoting this. So if you would rather see that with the nutrients as the rows, and then the points as the columns, so you can pivot the data. And then kind of the different way to think about that is the points as the rows and the data as columns. So that's kind of an option of how you want to consume that, if you will. A couple things to point out with this example is we also show you your yield data. So this is, again, kind of teasing out another new feature I'll talk more about in our next webinar. But as you start to fill out yield data, we're going to give you some more information about this field to help you make fertility recommendation decisions. So within this, you see our kind of min-max yield and where this particular field falls. Within metrics, because, for example, this has 48 sample points, we want to make it easy to roll up that data. So the metrics is a way where you can start to see the field averages across all 48 points within this view. So those are just a few things that you can do and see within here. You could export those results out if you needed the raw data. But now to kind of our new feature, which is based on these uploaded lab results, let's allow you to create vertebrate zones and prescriptions. So this is a gridded data set with lab results, and I'm going to be picking on phosphorus and potassium. And so I just keep in mind that we've got results for all those locations. So to do this, we select all the points that we want to include in our zone map. So with that, you again can filter out to say, I just want the most recent. I just want maybe 5 of these 10 results, and that's the kind of the selection view. But then what I did, let me take a step back. I clicked on this button on the top left, this black circle with the little squares in it. So it says create management zones. Clicking on that allows me to give this file a name. So let's just say I'm going to do a potash map. So say potash, we'll say egg vice results. That's optional. Descriptions just kind of for yourself to keep record and keep things clean. But now with that, I'm going to choose my potassium results from the lab. I can show labels. So this means once that zone creates, we're going to give those zones labels on this interactive map. What you can do now is we have what we call a clustering algorithm. And so this is more or less, without getting too deep in it, the interpolation method. So we have equal interval, quantiles, natural breaks. And we give you a description right here of what that's doing with your data. So this particular one, quantile, says orders the data by value first, then places them in bins such that each bin has the same number of items. And so it's kind of equally dividing that data. You can play around with those methods. We've got a support document that dives deeper into what those are doing. The minimum polygon size. So this is going to say, as we create these zones, what's your smallest or your cutoff of how small you're willing to make a zone? I'm just going to say 1 acre in this case. Finally, you put in your number of zones and your color palette. With this, we can now preview, and now this is generating that zone map based on those inputs, and you can see the output at this particular time. A couple things to note is we can now save this as a profile. So the things that we just walked through as far as the nutrient, the clustering method, the color schemes, the minimum zones, you can save that as a profile. So you don't have to go through that in the future. It's just saying choose from your drop-down list of profiles of how you want to create these zones. Another thing to note, and I'll just show you some of the other kind of breakpoints. So I did, the first one I did quantile. You could preview this for natural breaks. And so that's something where you can kind of, again, dig into those methods on what you'd prefer, how we kind of break that information down. It generates a pretty similar map, as you can see here. What you're seeing in the raw data down here, the left-hand side shows the zones. So zones 1 through 5, or 0 through 4, 5 total zones. One thing to note is you can still make some manual adjustments within this. So the results that you see here, this is the actual lab data. So you could say, I want a breakpoint. You can see the associated acres per zone. So maybe we need to drop this breakpoint down to maybe 275, and then you can preview that again. And now you can see, well, that zone popped out. So you've got kind of some levers and dials here where you can play with this until it reflects what you understand how the field is performing or looking. Regardless, we can now save this off. So we've created that K prescription. We could turn around and write another one, let's say for phosphorus, choose that nutrient as well, and again, create a profile for phosphorus. So what I'm doing now, if you have a pretty standardized flow for how you do these maps, you can use the templates to be pretty efficient with the creation side of things here. So let's just say this is, I'm going to do map here, and I'm going to show labels. So there we go. We've got 2 maps created based on the lab results. What you can do now, we've got a list view of all your zones, or you can come into the field view. So let's say I'm going to jump into my prescription field here and show you what that looks like. So this is kind of our basic field detail view that you're maybe familiar with, but what's new is the zone tab. So if I click on those zones, you can now see, I was doing some test data here. Let me delete that out. You should just see those 2 zones I just created. Let's delete that one out too. So at this point, you can interact with these. You can click to see those different zones with the labels associated with them. And then within each of these cells, if you will, we have the beaker icon. So that's the process of going from the zone. I now want to write a prescription. Keep in mind that you can now reuse these zones. And so if you create a zone that you're happy with and you want to manage on this going forward, this is something where these zones exist and you can just start to write prescriptions based on that. So let's say this is the map was the attribute that we're going to variable rate apply. And let's say you're going to put in your rates that you want to break those zones into. And then at this point, you can put a description there if you want, but that will actually generate a shapefile with that final prescription in it. So that's the flow. We could do the same thing for the potassium. We now have the prescriptions kind of listed out here, so you can re-download. They kind of exist with a real-time log as you create these and have them accessible. You can create and see your profiles, zone profiles within here as well. And so those are some of, I guess this is kind of in beta, so there's a lot more coming around this side, but it's what we've built so far for creation, prescription writing. What I'll do to kind of round this out is I'll jump into analytics or just show you some of the lab results if you simply want to see the lab results and help yourself make decisions on maybe trends across fields or within particular fields. So to do that, I'm going to jump over to my data set that has a little bit more content in it. And what you see here is I've turned on my soil sampling point layer. And so from your map, you can see where you've collected for a season or period of time. You can zoom in to see a couple things here. I'm going to jump in my 21 season. If I click on these pins from our main map view, you can interact with these pins, see the corresponding lab result by location. But then on the left-hand side, this is the metric information I referenced in the soil tab. where you're going to see the average values for each nutrient across the entire field. But then within this, you can actually start to chart this out. So that's where things get really interesting in FarmQA is this particular data set. It was actually tissue data, so I had more granularity or density, I should say, with the collection points. So you can see per every 2 weeks here, roughly, there was a collection or data point for ammonia. So you can start to see the trends of that data across a season. But more practically, let's say in the Midwest, you could upload a lab result per year. So you could get a very similar graph to this, but each point or dot represents a season. So let's say you've been working with the same lab for 15 years, out of the gate, you could get 15 points to show you on this beet field, how have your nutrients been trending. So that's one view, but then taking that one step further, we talked about kind of field by field comparisons. We can start to look at, first of all, a grid view. So within our report tab, you can start to save out views for just your soil data, and you can start to see this group, let's say by crop. Let's see if I group the column, you can start to see here's all of your corn data, your potato data averaged out, and you can drill into those cells to see your trends in a grid view. But then you can start to also graph this out. So a couple different things that you can do with this data for example, let's say we're looking at, let me go into soil nitrate. So you can average this, this is a better one, nitrogen by crop. So what this does is across all that data I just showed you in that Excel file, we are averaging that by date, by crop. So you start to get a line if you want to compare, what's my nitrogen levels in corn versus soybeans by date. You can start to look at those comparative trends versus maybe potatoes. You can start to give, we call them field average maps, but this allows you to think of it as a fill color. So red would mean you have lower nitrogen levels, green means sufficient, and then this time slider across the bottom allows you to go through the season. So we start out in May with sufficient levels, and I can click this play box, and it's going to step you through week by week where you start to see the consumption of that nitrogen, and then you start to get side dress applications to catch that up. So this is kind of a holistic view or map view of what's been going on with your fertility programs and applications. Now, to kind of roll this up or make it more visual, we've combined it into dashboards. And so this is kind of the grand finale of once you create those views, you can store those into a soil dashboard, for example, what I've done here. And so you're starting to put like those potassium comparison lines versus your interactive nitrogen consumption map versus your calcium by field. And so this is really where we're going with the product, is trying to make it easy for you to get this data in so that you can start to get to views like this, which help you make decisions, whether it's your variable rate fertility applications, or if you're just getting in here and writing treatment recommendations, that data can drive those decisions of how much to apply, based on lab results or based on the data over time. And then you can generate, let's say, an actionable shapefile with the variable rate. Maybe you write it out for planning purposes. You can get rolled up pricing per field or across a farm with something like this, where you've got your map and your TSP broken down by your average rates, or your average rates, multiply it out by the field size and the price. And so you can start to kind of get a full picture when it comes to soil sampling to fertility. So with that said, I know there's a lot of new content, and I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. And so hopefully, as you guys are watching this, you've got a good list of questions ready to fire at me, because I'm ready to take them. Excited to show this off. One thing to note, some of this stuff is, like I said, in beta. We're kind of shooting for December 1st kind of full release. And so sign up for our newsletters. That's when you'll see us call that out when it's ready to go. If you're really wanting to get your hands on this, I can actually get beta access to you if you reach out directly to me. But to close that out, we're going to jump to questions, and I've got a slide if anybody is curious on how to do that. So within Teams, you can see on the screen here, just the chat box, right-hand side, type in your message, and then here's my general contact information. So if you don't have time to stick around for the questions, feel free to reach out to me directly with any of these addresses or phone numbers you see here. And then lastly, we've got some upcoming webinars, so stay tuned for that. Again, I just teased out the kind of the scheduling, the tasking in FarmQA. The next webinar, I'll be doing a deeper dive into that to talk through how it pertains to scouting. You can do return tasks with that. Yeah, so anyway, that's what we've got for you today. Oh, sorry, I did forget one thing that I'll quickly show here. We did get some uptick from customers when it came to soil sampling to manage which fields have been collected. And so we can actually do that through a map view. So if you're looking at what I've done in this particular example is broken down what's not ready to be sampled, what's ready, and what's been done or completed. And so if you're managing a team, you can say, okay, what's been done, search the map, and you can see the acreage breakdown versus knowing where to send your trucks. It's in the green fields where it's ready. So another kind of component that I meant to end on, and I did miss that one. So you can ask away if you want to know more about that. You can ask in the questions, and I can spend a little more time on that. So with that, thanks for joining. I'm going to be looking over at the questions now. Thank you.